Hi, it's Ash from Revolution Me, and I'm doing this video because there's some crazy stuff been going on social media lately, and one of the issues that has come up is whether calorie restriction leads to eating disorders. Obviously, I'm talking about what's going on with Freely the Banana Girl and Durian Rider, who are getting sued for some comments that they've made about a diet program that encourages calorie restriction. So I'm here to address that. And a lot of people will say, well, where's the evidence that eating disorders are caused by calorie restriction? And my response is, we don't know what causes eating disorders. Okay, mental illness is very complex, it's very multifaceted, and there's a lot of risk factors. We've identified a number of risk factors for mental illness, and we can't say for sure what causes it. In order to prove conclusively that eating disorders could be caused by calorie restriction, and the key word here is causation, we'd need to have some pretty decent studies out there showing a group of people who underwent calorie restriction and had psych evaluations done before and after to prove that they actually developed eating disorders. And probably we'd need to have a comparison group of people who underwent the psych evaluations and kept eating their normal calorie intake during the period of time. And the two groups would need to be matched on a number of variables, things that are known risk factors like family history, personality style, thinking style, socioeconomic status, media exposure, and probably heaps more that I'm forgetting. Now, even further than that, people will talk about having, the gold standard scientific method, which is double-blind, randomized controlled trials, and having a double-blind study, which basically means that the people involved in the study don't know which group they belong to, and the people who are doing the psych evaluations don't know if they're seeing someone from the calorie restriction group or the comparison group. So in order to have a double-blind study, you probably need to have all your participants in a fairly contained environment where they were given their meals, they didn't know exactly how many calories they were eating, their expenditure was closely monitored, and a study like this, to be honest, the logistics of it are just mind-boggling. And it would be very, very expensive, not to mention completely unethical. Now, the closest thing that we have to a study like that is the Minnesota starvation experiment, which was done during the Second World War. It was done to look at the physiological impact of calorie restriction, and it was done at a time when there were a lot of people who were starving, a lot of people in war-affected countries who needed to be rehabilitated. So there was a lot of incentive for this kind of research. Bear in mind that the purpose of the study was to look at the physical effects. The volunteers, they were screened, and I think it was to see whether they would drop out of the study. So they did have psychological screening, but there wasn't any psychological screening done after the study finished, as far as I know. And the psychological manifestations, the behaviors that these volunteers demonstrated were incidental findings, and they're absolutely fascinating. They showed some signs of body dysmorphia because they started to view their emaciated body as being normal, whereas people sort of out in the general community who weren't emaciated, they started to view them as being overweight. And we know that that kind of body dysmorphia is very common in certain eating disorders such as anorexia. If you have a look at the revised guidelines for anorexia in the DSM-5, so that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which the 5th edition came out just a couple of years ago, you'll see that the first criteria is that the person must calorie restrict and refuse to maintain a healthy body weight. Now, what's healthy does depend on the individual and their health markers, their fitness level, their quality of life. There's so many things there. You can't just look at a person and just because they're thin, that means that they've got an eating disorder. So the question goes back to, does calorie restriction cause eating disorders? And I think calorie restriction is a major risk factor. There are some people who are prone to depression or anxiety or eating disorders, maybe genetic vulnerability there, and putting them on a calorie restriction program might lead to eating disorders. I don't think we can say conclusively that calorie restriction causes eating disorders. I don't think we can say conclusively that anything causes eating disorders. We just know what the risk factors are. If you undergo a program where you're exercising a lot and you're not eating the sufficient calories, that an eating disorder is a risk. Just like we have warning inserts on medications listing some of the possible side effects, I think it's a responsibility of people who promote certain diets to let their consumers know that an eating disorder is a real risk. Because unfortunately what happens is young impressionable girls, they go on these programs, they think they're getting healthy when actually they're going on these programs to be a certain size or be a certain weight, and so it's not necessarily health. They calorie restrict, maybe for them that is what triggers them into an eating disorder, or it changes their mindset in such a way that it affects their psychological health. And these girls had no idea that that was a possible outcome. So I trust you find this video useful, addressing the question of whether calorie restriction promotes eating disorders. If you got any questions or comments, pop them down below, and I'll catch you in the next video.